Hi everybody, I'm Jaya Deshmukh. I'm the EVP for Strategy and Transformation at Colt, and I'm delighted today to have with me at this Fireside Chat Pascal Matzke, VP and Research Director from Forrester Research. Welcome, Pascal.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you, and I'm sure that this is going to be a real exciting and interesting chat given by the conversation that we've had before. So, Pascal, just to set us up, as you're aware, Colt positions itself as a global digital infrastructure company, that the world's leading organizations choose to connect with. So, when you hear that, what's your definition of digital infrastructure? How do you see it?
Well, for me, the digital infrastructure really encompasses everything in terms of hardware and software that allows us to shift towards a digital business. Now, what is a digital business, you may ask? The digital business is different from the traditional business in that we are shifting away from business models that are focused on linear transactions, where you go out and buy something and then you take it home, to the model of continuous interaction around a product, a service. And this is true not just in the customer context, but also in the employee context. If you think about supply chains, wherever we move physical goods, it's no longer a transaction, it's an interaction around where does the good come from, where does it need to go, how does it fit into the broader supply chain context. And so the digital infrastructure in that context now really allows us to drive a sense and respond attitude around how we move things about in the context of these digital business, away from the transaction mode to the interaction mode. And this is why then the digital infrastructure becomes kind of the glue that sort of holds everything together, that orchestrates to allow us to sort of drive value in the context of these continuous interactions rather than the linear transactions.
I love that. I mean, I think I really like that line, and I'm going to use it, plagiarize it everywhere. Moving from transactions to interactions. I think that's really important because transaction presupposes a one-way street, while a interaction is an ongoing dialogue.
It also has significant ramifications in terms of the metrics. Right. We always measure the cost of a transaction. Yes. The value of the interaction is measured in terms of the Net Promoter Score, revenue growth. The way you are actually going to bring down your carbon emissions, for instance, could be another metric. So again, the value that we put into these kind of business models is ultimately driving us away from the mere focus of just linear efficiencies as measured by the cost of a transaction to the value of the effectiveness, which is then measured in the context of the Net Promoter Score. How likely are we to use the service again? And are we going to ultimately drive inherent value through, again, growth or carbon emission reduction or something like that. So it's really, the digital infrastructure in that context is the fabric to allow us to also then measure the value of these interactions in a profoundly different way.
So if I were to rephrase that or play it back to you, you're saying that as business models move from transactions to interactions, digital infrastructure acts as a glue. And digital infrastructure also allows you to measure this movement. Right?
That's exactly right. And this is why there is, in my view, a little bit of a misunderstanding to look at infrastructure just as a commodity. Because in this context, if you think about all the great innovations that we've brought to the infrastructure in and of itself, whether it's 5G, SD-WAN, AI, edge computing, it is so critical to understand that without all of these innovations, we wouldn't be able to facilitate some of these interaction modes. And so they become truly critical, not just for us to measure what we are driving in terms of interaction value today, but also to predict how that value is going to change by having more interactions, allowing us then to sort of forecast and drive sort of a forward-looking perspective into how these businesses might evolve going forward. So the digital infrastructure is not just infrastructure in the context of the hardware and software that you put on your network. Yeah. It's really becoming, as you said, the fabric that allows us then to really sort of elevate from this transaction mode into the interaction business.
And this is really interesting because when we, when Kerry, our CEO, she came on board and she became our CEO, the big shift that she saw in this industry was this thing, moving away from transactional towards interaction, but the way we experienced interaction was that our enterprise customers were looking for flexible solutions. And because, earlier they would say, hey, I want a circuit from this point to that point. Now they began to say, I have a digital imperative. I need a 360-degree view of the customer, or I need smart manufacturing. And for that digital imperative, they needed digital infrastructure. And so we saw that being constrained either as a telco or to be very transactional in our approach wouldn't work, and hence this move to being a global digital infrastructure player. What's your take? I mean, how do you see this path from digital infrastructure, transactions, interactions, customer experience?
Well, from an end user perspective, and I talk to CIOs, I always tell them, look for a good business partner on your business side and try to execute this end-to-end vision on the basis of a smaller scale project.
Yeah.
Document that and then scale it up so that you can also build trust with the other business stakeholders to help them understand how they also can gain value from a more end-to-end perspective. So we've seen this, for instance, again, in the context of the pandemic or the aftermath of the pandemic around employee experience, for instance. A lot of remote workers needed to be connected. Remote engineers still needed to go out to clients to conduct services on connected machines, right? Yeah. And so you saw that driven by necessity and urgency, certain stakeholders were really sort of driving or were looking to drive more value out of their infrastructure in the context of a more interaction pattern around employee experience, right? Employee retention, employee satisfaction, productivity, of course, as well. And so wherever CIOs that had a way to document that in the context of a smaller use case, to say we supported this, let's say, field service engineering operations through a digital infrastructure approach where we measure things more end to end. And this was also then the governance process. This is how we arrived at the right metrics. We used maybe OKRs as a way to sort of drive the right value proposition. We used an as-a-service business model to drive more cost transparency into how we sort of then drive investments around continual change. If you document that based on a lighthouse case study and then start to internally market it, drive relevancy into other businesses as well, then you start to have not just a use case, but then you start to sort of create a governance structure that you can scale. You start to have a metrics library that you can leverage. And you also hopefully will start to have a partner ecosystem structure into which you can tap into as you need to elevate from one lighthouse to the next.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, Colt has always been really obsessed with customer experience. But like you said, over the pandemic, the way we define customer experience kind of broadened out, because we realized it's not just the customer experience, it's also employee experience, it's also partner experience, it's the experience of that ecosystem. It's really been important for us, and I think it's because as a leadership team we focus on it. Hopefully what we're doing here internally within Colt can translate into bringing that to our end customers, partners. It'll be interesting to understand from you. Are you seeing this change from a leadership perspective? Are you is it that as you said, everything is siloed? Who owns this this obsession with experience within enterprise customers?
Well, ultimately, there's an old German saying, the fish stinks from the head, which means that without a strong executive mandate, it's not going to happen. And I've observed this in particular with several of my manufacturing clients, in particular in the context of smart manufacturing. Unless there is a strong mandate from the top, where you're not just propagating as a CEO the shift to, let's say, smart manufacturing or smart supply chain, but where you really also are willing to change the metrics of your middle management, because ultimately it's the middle management layer, right? So you need to. So there's one German customer, for instance, I've been working with, where they have also, like you, changed all the metrics for all the key executives and the middle management away from driving revenue growth or achieving EBITDA margin to driving the net promoter score. And this is for a B2B smart manufacturer. So this is a company that sells big machines, right? Because they realize that it's no longer about how much contract value we can drive around selling big machines and fixed capital assets.
Yep.
No, it's the services around these assets.
Yep.
That ultimately will give us the margin, will give us the incremental revenue growth and create the stickiness with the end customer. So what we have talked about in the B2C world for so many years is finally becoming true in B2B. But the point is, you have to have the mandate from the top. I have so many CIOs, even chief digital officers, who tell me, we would love to go there, but still, my management is not really committed. They're still running after the short return on investment. They're driven by shareholder value, quarterly earning reports, you know. It has to be all about the efficiency. And yes, we may have a vision, but we don't really have a strategy to execute on it. And it really starts with the metrics, your internal metrics, that then have to reflect on what it is that you want to achieve. And it doesn't always have to, I mean, NPS is a great metric, but it's not always the right one. So it could be time to market. You mentioned ESG, you know, environmental sustainability. This is super important, not just in the way of, you know, driving customer value and customer retention, but also for employees, you know, the younger generation employees. They don't want to work for a company that is polluting the air. There are other metrics, you know, that have to do with innovation, for instance. How quickly can we innovate around a connected product or a connected experience to really drive, you know, stickiness with the market and drive maybe also co-innovation with other companies to bring us, you know, this kind of new value equation. But again, to your question, it doesn't work without a strong mandate from the top. And I think there's a growing recognition in many of the executive boards that customer obsession, as you say, is quite important. But how to then drive a governance structure around it, how to measure it, how to reward people in the right way, how to shift away from sales incentives that reward you on, you know, one-time contract value to sales incentives that reward the continuous interaction based on incremental value growth. That is hard, right? And that's a cultural change that, you know, most companies still have to attack and where, again, I see some progress, but where other CEOs are still a little hesitant to really sort of take it on.
And maybe this is a good point to talk or, you know, segue into talk about this partnerships that you mentioned, and you talked about this ecosystem. Would you like to explain a little more?
Yeah, again, I think with everything that we talked about so far, again, we started with this context of business models shifting from linear transaction to continuous interaction. So if you understand that the inherent value that you provide as a business to your customers is changing away from efficiency metrics to effectiveness, then of course your supplier orchestration or your sourcing management or your procurement also will have to change. And so, again, I guess the tagline is to shift from tactical supplier management to strategic partnership management. Now, this is, again, not something that I would argue is going to happen across the board, because there are certain elements that always will be commodity. But I think the realization that we just talked about is that what currently is perceived as commodity, which is the network infrastructure, is so important, and it's also so enriched by all these other elements of technology, the AI, the software, the connectivity, innovation that we talked about, that it's really sort of requiring a very different approach in the way, as a company, you have to look towards your providers. Because as we said, it's not just about the existing infrastructure and how to operate it in a safe and reliable fashion, but it's also the sandbox, it's the innovation, it's the forward-looking momentum, because the infrastructure gives me all that effect. So what we see with a lot of companies is that they're moving to this, what we call more of a partnership-driven supplier approach, where they would like to work with a fewer but more strategic partners that cover all the respective elements of infrastructure, software, hardware, services, and then have them also orchestrate some of the other partners into that same channel. Now, again, the big problem that I see in the execution of this is that a lot of the sourcing and procurement functions today are still very cost-driven. And so we have great conversations with our CIO clients, with our chief digital officer clients about that. But then as soon as we start to talk to the sourcing and vendor management function, it gets more difficult, because there you still have traditional metrics, and they still want to have list prices lined out next to each other, and so it becomes a very different conversation. So I think, again, it requires the mandate from whoever is really in charge in the digital business, in the customer experience, in the employee experience, to set out a clear target. What is it that we want to achieve? And then we orchestrate the right partner ecosystem through a smaller group of strategic partners that then can work for us with some of the other maybe smaller partners to really bring this orchestration to bear.
When we talk about our partners and how do we select the right partners, yes, of course, it's about efficiency, go to market, but I think it's more about cultural fit, ESG, diversity and inclusion.
It's the levels of trust.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, what you just described is exactly right. And again, to become the strategic partner, it's not about the best price alone. It's also about the trust levels that you can bring to the table. But I think there's another element here, and I think you alluded to this just briefly, is you also will be, I mean, we used to talk about head contractor, subcontractor roles in the past. Now we talk about orchestration, right? So for you also to bring to market your partner ecosystem, not just to manage your own portfolio, but also be able to then bring in an emerging technology company or maybe a startup from a certain technology area will also be important. So the partnership equation, yes, the trust levers are super important, but then how do you govern this? How do you manage this? We talked about the contractual elements of this, but there's also a way of again, driving a multi-stakeholder ecosystem, you sitting in the middle or driving the round table between the digital leaders, the technology leaders, the operational leaders, the CFO, the procurement people, and then being able to moderate this for the customer, with the customer, so that they can also connect amongst themselves, right? And I think that's a quality that ultimately defines what a strategic partner for any enterprise can be. This is not to say that we would expect a company like Colt or any other vendor to take over this internal orchestration altogether, but to help clients to connect the dots, right? Because a lot of these siloed business structures that we talked about at the beginning still need connections. And I think that's where the strategic partner capability of someone like Colt will have to shine, is in this multi-stakeholder ecosystem management that you will have to facilitate.
Thank you, Pascal. I mean, you said it very, very well. And, yes, I think the network, digital infrastructure connects to every application. And if it connects to every application, it connects eventually to the, everybody in an organization, and therefore even the experience that that company is giving out to its people or its partners or its customers. So I think from a stack perspective, digital infrastructure really binds everything together. So one of the things I wanted to pick your brains on, Pascal, was some of the shifts that we saw. So when, 2014, I think we could say is the year when cloud really came into its own. And then we've seen this rapid cloudification. I think the main thing that happened with cloud was the experience, that whether you're an employee or a B2C, B2B, it completely changed, it radically changed. And when you take cloud and you take as a service and you combine it, it became really powerful. So the customer experience, customer behavior, journey totally changed with cloud, the efficiency has changed. And from an infrastructure perspective, digital infrastructure perspective, what became really important from a product or solution sense was connectivity to DCs. Right? What was your, how many DCs are you connecting, right? Were you hand in glove with all the hyperscalers as they built out their data center, infrastructure? The other thing that became very important was, direct internet access, right? So dedicated internet access. How could anybody connect very quickly to the application wherever they were? And I think with the pandemic that even got larger. Now the reason I'm building this up is you can really see evolution of the customer journey, customer experience, because of a technological shift which was cloud. And we can track the same kind of shifts in the previous big shifts, which were mobile and the internet. Or I like to say, first came the telcos, then came the internet, then came mobile, then came cloud. And I think we are sitting on that cusp of, where AI, and we've been talking about AI for a long time, but I think we are now really going to see this whole commercialization or general availability of AI, and that's going to permeate everything. So if you see this as an evolution, how do you think it's going to really impact customer journeys, experience, and therefore digital infrastructure partnerships?
Well, let's start with the digital infrastructure first, because everything that you just talked about in the way of how you have to bring together all these different elements and complexity in the infrastructure in and of itself, how to connect to the hyperscalers, to the DCs, how to connect to, unlimited numbers of devices and create this sense and response pattern. Where the AI will have a massive impact is in the automation of all of these elements, right? I think that's where, again, where we not just drive efficiency, but where we also can then create new opportunities for businesses to leverage the digital infrastructure in a totally new way. So from the actual infrastructure automation itself, we then move up into the automation and the AI-driven sense and respond data infrastructure. So again, with all the data now inherently available, facilitating new customer journeys, driving information and predictions around customer demand or employee experience, we are now in a much better position already to determine how to support certain services out there in the field or in any sort of digital or physical context. Now, as it relates to customer experience, now there's the next dimension, right? Because we now take all of this automation that comes in the infrastructure on the data side, and we put it in front of the customer itself. That's where things are still getting a little tricky. So there's a lot of opportunity, obviously, to help, provide better customer services, better customer experiences, drive the continuous training of your customer agent while they're still talking to the customer, creating more listening opportunities with customers, and also determining, how customer interactions in the future will like to change. I think we still have to be careful in the sense of how much of that, in particular generative AI, we put in front of the customer, because of not just because of security concerns, but because also of some of the issues that this may cause in the context of backfiring if something goes wrong. So my recommendation here is, again, to think about this in the context of a continuous. We talk about innovation towers. It was about the cloud. You said it was about the telcos first. It was about the cloud. It was about data. It was about the automation of the fabric. Yeah. And now it's about taking the selective pieces of this and being able to really drive tangible business value. So be careful, but be innovative. Yeah. Be creative, but also respect your customers' privacy and understand that customers will not forgive you if something goes wrong. And so to this end, whilst there are great opportunities and people should absolutely experiment with it, pick your experimentation areas, your sandboxes, very wisely, so that you can ultimately really learn and drive a sense and response service around also the AI-driven customer experience.
I cannot agree more. I think we have to be careful as we experiment. We should require real near-time latency. Generally, how much latency do we really need?
Well, I think there's still, traffic management, signaling technology, right? Look at the streets of London. There are great examples of how they use generative AI and other automation technologies to just manage the traffic flow. Physical spaces in industries, in hospitality areas where you have to move quickly to steer people in the right direction. Again, it's about what does the sandbox really look like? How confined is it so that I can still have sufficient security and risk mitigation built around it to still create a great customer experience, really drive customer value without overly exposing myself to some of the still underlying flaws of what the technology provides.
Absolutely. I think right now, if you look at the stage of generative AI, it's really good at sourcing public data sets, right? And I'm sure down the path, a few years from now, maybe even months from now, it's learning so fast, we'll be able to deploy that same kind of prompt into internal data sets. I don't think we are there yet, but it will be interesting to see what will happen when we turn it inside. And then what are they, what happens then to circuits?
Yeah.
But it'll be an interesting journey.
And we shouldn't discourage people from not using it, right? I think that's absolutely key. We always need to innovate, and we also need to be creative, but we also need to understand how to contain risk, in particular in a market where people are very sensitive to some of the data protection issues, and obviously, that's something we have to respect.
As we see the influx of this change, so of course cloud is really important, but along with cloud, as you must have noticed, that everyone really has noticed that there's a shift, and Sundar Pichai says this is one of the major shifts in our industry, that we're getting generative AI and the commercialization of AI, right? I think that's going to be the next 5 years. So what's your take on that as we move from this cloud alone to cloud plus AI, and the impact on customer journeys, because they're going to change dramatically, and then what would then the impact be on digital infrastructure?
Yes, the cloud obviously, and the way the cloud now connects, and it makes everything ubiquitous in the way we have access to generative AI, for instance. It's a great way to sort of kickstart certain technology evolutions. But again, as we've also seen with other technology evolutions in the past, there will always be also setbacks, right? And I think one of the things, again, that the digital infrastructure helps us to manage is how, for instance, in the context of generative AI, we can not only drive the elevation and the innovation, but also mitigate the risk. And I think that's a very important part of the equation that you can bring to the table. Because again, as we said, this is about creating business models that are around sense and respond. And when the sensing isn't right because of how I'm maybe not using the right AI engine, and I have the garbage in, garbage out issue, I will fail in my business model, right? And so I think there is a very key equation here that customers will value from anybody who is providing these kind of digital infrastructure elements.
All of these movements that you've described, if you were to give some advice to a company that's starting out on this journey, or even to Colt, that, hey, Colt, pay attention to this. This is the skill, this is the attitude you need. So what advice would that be?
I guess we talked about lighthouses earlier, right? So define a small lighthouse and execute it well, and then document it and talk about it. For clients, I always say, look no further than your own employee experience, because I think employee experience is so critical these days. We have a massive shift in the generation of employees. Their attitude is changing, their working styles are changing. And there is a lot there that you can do using digital infrastructure, but also using a different modus operandi, using a different way of engaging with your folks, shifting from a command and control structure to a clustered mode of operation, facilitated by the interaction patterns that the digital infrastructure helps you to sustain. Look for an employee experience dimension. I mean, it could be as simple as moving your expense management system into the cloud and driving it. I mean, something that really then not only drives value in the context of efficiency, but really has an effectiveness impact, productivity, employee retention, employee satisfaction, something like that. Employee experience, to me, really ultimately drives customer experience. There is no question. And so the low-hanging fruit, and also because you will find your strategic partners in the HR department, in the business department. So start your lighthouse there, because caring about your people is always the right thing. And understanding that there's massive change in the behavioral attitudes of your employees, given also the skill shortage that we have on the market, is super critical. So I think that's the low-hanging fruit. More longer term, though, of course, you have to elevate from what you drive around an interaction with employees to an interaction around your clients and the employees, and maybe a business model change, right? We talked about mobility, right? And how car companies are struggling to still make money from just selling cars to, shifting to business models where it's about mobility as a service. The same is true for any of the public transport operators as well. So you shift your business model, right? And I think that's where, again, you will have to start small. So it's maybe a single product, it's a single customer journey scheme, or the clustering of certain customer journeys in a new context, and learn from it gradually. Drive awareness, measure it continuously, and also help people to understand how these new metrics are ultimately helping you to drive more sustainable value than the old metrics. Shifting from traditional ROI, TCO type calculations to something that embodies, for instance, the measurement of the quality of an option, the flexibility, the total economic impact, as Forrester would call it. So these are really important steps. Start small, maybe start with an employee experience dimension. I think for someone like Colt, as I said earlier, it's all about you becoming more involved in this internal multi-stakeholder discussion, driving the round table, often becoming the moderator and the mediator of the different client constituencies, but then also proving your point by supporting some of these smaller lighthouse case studies and helping the client, your network manager or your telecom infrastructure manager, to help them sell this to other business stakeholders. Great use cases, come up with the right metrics, have templates that help you to assess the maturity of the customer in the context of the journey that we described earlier. These are all very important tools, but I think we are really in a pivotal moment in time. It's time to shift away from focusing on infrastructure, on automation as a tactical tool for just driving the efficiency. It's now really about leveraging all these technologies and opportunities to drive long-term strategic value. Realizing, of course, that the only thing that I know for sure that's coming is there's more change.
Yeah.
I don't know what the change is, but because we are living in this continuously changing market environment, the best you can do is create options for yourself, and that's how you ultimately can support it.
Well, thank you so much, Pascal. I must say this was a fascinating and wonderful dialogue. There's so many questions I have, and there's so much I'd like to learn from you. That's the reason why I love this industry. It's constantly evolving and changing, and there's so much that we can do. I hope all of you enjoyed this conversation. I certainly did, and you could have seen, we really had so much to talk about. But if you're interested in learning more and understanding how digital infrastructure really changes lives and really is evolving and changing the world as we see it, then do log on again to www.colt.net to get some more information.